The recession actually impacted the consumer appliance markets globally very differently. So you can actually see that there's quite a big difference from those markets who suffered in terms of real GDP drops and those developed markets which suffered those big drops versus emerging markets which were less actually affected. Also affected them regionally as well. So for example, the US dropped very severely in terms of real GDP drops. Increases in unemployment obviously severely affected the markets. There were some markets which actually performed very differently. So say for example we have Germany, who actually increased unit volumes by 4% last year in terms of consumer appliance unit volumes. During the time, a lot of developed markets last year, the retailers were actually dropping unit prices. So German consumers were able to go out and take their savings ratio, the very high savings of disposable income, and actually go out and buy appliances. But if you look at it, that's a short-term effect. So savings ratios, as I said, went from 15.7. That actually dropped to 15.4, 15.3. It's actually quite a strong drop in savings ratios. The recession really impacted different markets completely differently globally, and it wasn't just a uniform drop for developed markets and a uniform increase for emerging markets. And the problem really is with the consumer appliance goods is the fact that they got such a high ticket price, especially for major appliances. In terms of major appliances out of FMCG or CPG goods, they are the highest unit price. This is why they suffered so heavily. This is why they're so susceptible to macroeconomic and endogenous factors and shocks. So if you have a look at China, China, the growth there was very strong in 2009, and the projected growth over the next 5 years is the strongest out of any major appliance market. It has very favourable fundamentals as well. It's got very low penetration rates. So if you look at fridge freezers in the US and the UK, you're looking at about 91 to 98%, roughly around that. Within China, you're looking at a much lower level, 50-60% for a lot of the major appliance categories. So there is potential there. Then you've got the favourable macroeconomic situation, and also as well the government last year was actually implementing various different programs for rural consumption of appliances. That was huge, that really was. But there's a lot of markets within Asia which have really avoided a lot of the recessionary impact. Japan, for example, even though it did suffer quite heavily, because it is adjacent to a lot of the Asian markets, it's actually it's a stronger position than, say, for example, the UK or France. Germany is in a stronger position than both of those, but still, it's going to be, at least 2010 will be a year of adjustment. We'll see some minimal growth, but we're not going to return to 4 or 5% growth for a lot of developed markets. Well, there are, within the major appliance categories, there are certain categories which avoided such an impact from the recession. It does completely matter from country to country, but on a global perspective, we actually saw dishwashers suffering the most. And if we have a look at a case study, say for example for dishwashers, the reason why it suffered so badly is because it is a non-essential major appliance. You can put off replacing your dishwasher or acquiring a dishwasher because the unit price is actually quite high, and it's not as though you essentially need that. Large cooking is much more essential, or refrigeration is much more essential than dishwashers. Also as well, the penetration of dishwashers on a global level is really isolated towards a few markets in North America and Western Europe. So it's really the US, it's the UK, and Spain. But if you look at those two markets, they suffered heavily during 2009. So with 60% of unit volumes within 3 major markets, developed markets, it really suffered very heavily. The potential growth for the category is there, but we're not going to see the growth realised, I don't think, for over the medium term. There is potential growth within the Asian markets, but there's such a low penetration at the moment. It's really much more getting consumers to understand what they're buying, understanding the Asian consumers, for example, why they'd be using it, and also looking really at R&D for dishwashers, because there is no uniform end product, and I think that's really the problem really for the category.